This was one long piece of teak. It was a cap rail from a Grand Banks boat I cut up a few years back, and it's been sitting, so might as well use it. Only problem is it has a screw in it every about 8 inches, so I'm gonna have to get those out, plug the holes, and it's got 2 curves in it that I don't need. So basically I just need to square this stock up. So first thing I did was run the belt sander across the bottoms of these things to flush out the remaining part of the screws so they wouldn't hang up in the table saw. So by ripping a little bit of the round part off of each edge, I now have something more stable to stand it up and cut it. And I'm going to use the bottom as a reference because the bottom was never exposed to the sun and worn, and the bottom's never been sanded. Well, maybe pieces of it, but typically people sand the tops of the handrails and not the bottom, so the top is kind of warpy. So I just want to cut a little bit off. I don't want to get into the screw heads because the saw will cut them, they're bronze, but they'll come flying out at me, so this is just a trim pass. Pop these plugs out now because they're so thin, there's nothing left of them. I wanted to spin these a couple of times before I banged them out just to make sure they didn't have any threads still engaged in the wood. And it kind of just helps loosen them up so they'll come out easier with less damage. These were Manley screws, number 14. Don't use those anymore. Put up this little piece of old teak deck because I want the teak strips for the top of the box. So I think I'm going to cut like every other board just through the plywood and then stand it up and rip the plywood off. So boy, this polysulfide deck caulk, I'm assuming that's what it is. It looks like it's 30 or 40 years old and you think it's no good, but I cut the plywood on the back and you still can't pull it apart. It's still elastic, it's still sticky. Pretty impressive stuff. So reclaiming all these strips was a little bit of a pain, but one, you can't really buy this quality of teak anymore. 2, it's very expensive. And 3, I'm just kind of fruit about saving old wood and reusing it. So this is what we did. The company that made this boat that I cut up is called Grand Banks. This cut up boat was a sister ship to my wooden boat that I just recently sold. And it's also the same brand of boat that the box is going to go on, although its new home is a newer version. It's a fiberglass boat. And they use some sort of black glue to glue their decks down onto the plywood subsurface. And nobody's ever said what the name of that glue is, but it's tenacious. It doesn't come off, so the only really practical way to separate these is just saw them through the glue line and cut the glue line off.
So the next few steps is basically I'm cleaning one edge of the remaining rubber, first with the knife and then sanding a little bit so that it'll run smooth on the table saw fence without grabbing or rocking. And then I cut the opposite edge parallel, and then I recut the rabbet, which is the space where the rubber caulk will be placed. All of this is easier on the table saw than trying to do it with a router once it's in place.
So I started out by adding a 3/8 lip around the outside of where the box is, which equates to the red line. And on the back cabin, the front cabin of the boat has a slight curve to it. I added 3/4, and I'm thinking I'm going to scribe it in place and try to get it down to be 3/8 in the middle and probably 3/4 on each side. And then on the corners, I think they will look better if the angle is split half and half. So I split the angles with the compass, and I'm ready to start cutting. But my teak is kind of precious to me, so I'll cut up some scraps of some bad pieces of pecan, and I'm going to make some practice boards and make sure it's all going to work before I cut any teak. Okay, this frame has been anything but easy. I bet I've cut all the corners 3 times so far. And I cut the groove, and it didn't go well. The box is just out of square enough, and the corners are round, and they're not exactly the same. Just enough to make it tough. So I think what I'm going to do is glue this template together from the bottom. Like put some plywood strips in the corners to make sure it doesn't move, and I'll use it as a template for the teak. The outside perimeter is great. On the teak, it needs to be strong. It's going to be outdoors, so just a butt joint will not do. To make it strong, I think I'll route a groove on both sides of each joint and slip a loose tenon in, a teak tenon on all of these joints. So when I get the top the right size and get it glued and get it dried and strong, then I'm going to set it on top of the box and scribe the fiberglass under it and use a router to cut the groove, because there's just too many variables for the table saw. So yesterday I managed to cut my teak pieces. I cut the splines and I epoxied everything and clamped it, which was kind of tricky. And I brought it into my wife's studio where it's warm, and it actually cured overnight. So today I can take all my clamps off and kind of clean up, do a little belt sanding, and look at cutting the groove in the bottom.
So the old screw holes, the big holes, this is the bottom. They fell half in and half out of where I wanted to cut the joint to make the box waterproof. So rather than deal with this later, the time is now. I'm drilling them out to a size that I have a plug cutter for, and then I will cut plugs and glue them in. And I'm using yellow glue, which is waterproof, but this is the bottom, so it's not going to see as much abuse from the sun as the plugs on top. I will use epoxy on those. And while the glue is wet, I put the belt sander on them and flush them out, and that drives the fine sawdust from the sanding operation into whatever imperfections there are in the hole, and it sticks with the wet glue, and it's a real easy thing to do, and it looks really good. I used to use the table saw to free up the plugs after I drilled them, but with my 65-year-old eyeballs, sometimes I would confuse the saw mark with the grain, and then when the plug was dry and I sand it, the grain would be going the wrong way. So now I'll just take a screwdriver and break them out, and that way you can usually see the grain because of the fractured surface, and it makes it much less likely that I get them in the wrong place.
Got a 1/2 inch bit in the router. I got a straight edge. I think everything is lovely. I'm gonna cut this long straight part with the big router with the 1/2 inch bit, and the little curvy parts I'm gonna catch with the little router and a 1/4 inch bit and just freehand them. By the way, this is my favorite router jig. You just nail a board to a scrap of plywood. The board needs to have a straight edge. And then you take the router and trim this edge of your plywood with the bit you're going to use. So then, when you clamp your guide, you know that the router is going to cut exactly on this edge of the plywood. And it makes it real easy. Okay, that was a big step, and I didn't mess it up. Fits. It's a little bit snug, but I think fine tuning should be done after I set the bottom in and rip it in half of the hinge, because it's going to change a little bit. But for right now, pretty cool. Okay, after I got the groove all cleaned up, I cut a rabbet around the perimeter. This is the bottom. What this is for is to hold the bottom plywood, and the bottom plywood is to hold up all those little pieces of teak that I cleaned earlier in the video. And I kind of have a conundrum right now. The top has a little bit of a bow in it, so what I really want to do is weight it down on this flat surface, which is my table saw. But man, we're marginal on the temperature, so I don't want it not to cure. So, but I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to weight it down and hope that when it cures, or hope it'll cure. And then when it does cure, hopefully some of the twist will be out of it. We had some borderline temperatures yesterday, but everything's hard. If it's hard in the cup, that means it's hard everywhere else. So time to unclamp this and look at filling with the cut all the little strips to fit, and I had 2 extra. And now I'm going to remove them, apply a layer of epoxy, and weight them down for the rest of the day. It's really cold right now. It's in the 30s, but it's supposed to warm up to the 60s. So I'm hoping by the end of the day that the epoxy will set. I also drilled out the holes where the old screws were to a size I have a plug for. And I'll plug those, and I'm getting close. So we had milder temperatures last night for a change, so I'm pretty confident that this epoxy set up without a problem. I glued it yesterday morning. Right. Yep, so what I need to do now is to route a groove around the perimeter to match these grooves, and then I'll fill it with the caulk, the Teak deck caulk, and sand it smooth around these corners. The top will be coming along nicely.
So with a different router and a different bit, the old guide is not any good, so I just turned it over and cut the other side. caulk is called TDS, Teak Deck Solutions, I think. It is the only caulk that should be used on this kind of application. First, I primed all the joints with a thin down version of the clear penetrating epoxy sealer. That's the two cans in the background. And I let the solvents dry out of that. It makes it just a little bit sticky, and it helps overcome the natural oil in teak, which kind of prevents things from sticking to it. And then you just push this caulk in. You don't have to worry about being neat because we're going to sand it all down. I left all the little boards in the middle a little proud so I could sand maybe 1/16 of an inch off of them. Then I come back with a spatula and further compress the caulk just to make sure that it is 100% in all the voids. We don't want an air bubble in there to come back on us later.
Okay, after the caulk cured for a few days, I'm starting to sand it. I'm really removing a lot of wood because I let the these boards were weathered, these little boards, and these were planed. So I left these proud so I could kind of carve down to some unweathered wood to make them all match. I've got a very coarse belt on my sander to remove stuff quickly, but as soon as it gets level, I'm going to switch to a finer grit, and then I'll finish with the random orbital sander. The really neat thing about this caulk, in spite of being very rubbery and soft, squishy, you can sand it. It doesn't melt. It doesn't melt and clog up your belt like most caulks do. Okay, just finished with the 50 grit. You can see the belt still is unclogged. It's pretty amazing. Now I'm going to go with the 80 grit and clean it up some, and then I'll finish it with the 120 grit on the belt sander. Now this material I made this top out of came from a boat that was made in 1970, and I cut it up about 3 years ago. No, more than that, 5 years ago, which would make it 2003. So it was out in the sun and the weather for 34 years, 33 years, and just 1/16 of an inch below the weathered surface. It looks like brand new. I love this stuff. So the owner can either leave it be and let it go gray, and it'll be kind of a non-slip surface, which is my preference, but he might want to varnish it and get it shiny. If he varnishes it, it's going to look kind of like this. But, you know, once you varnish, you got to keep on varnishing. Either way, it's a beautiful wood. So cut the top in half for the hinge, and this is where it wants to fit. It's in the groove, and this is kind of tight. I could take the saw and just cut this groove wider. Probably gonna be the easiest thing. Or I could route some more on this groove so it can scoot back a little bit more. That would make the sides line up better. I gotta cut something. Or I could cut the front. I think I'm gonna cut this groove a little wider. So I have have a stainless steel piano hinge I mounted on the fixed part of the top, and I got it really straight and pretty, but when I screwed the other half to the leaf, the movable part, it had a big bow in it. So plugged all the holes with toothpicks and glue and let that dry, and I'll try it again this afternoon. So the top is working really well. I have it clamped in place and everything's good, but I don't have a way to fasten it. So I'm going to take these aluminum angles and rip them on the table saw, where I can probably through bolt them to here. Probably through bolt them through here because this is thick and heavy, and then try to get some vertical screws up into the teak. That way the top will be removable come refinishing time. Probably put one on each end. And I need to hit the top with the roundover bit and deliver it. I'm gonna he's got some painters that paint on his boat. I'll let them do the final painting. Probably do a better job than me anyway. So come along. I got the two little angles ripped down and screwed to the back and the top. And I got the top kind of rounded over a little bit. And the box is done. Time to deliver it.